Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Razdan. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dignitaries and experts on the desk. I don't have a presentation, which is quite unlike a consultant, but let me have a go with some thoughts which I want to share with you. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. Today is a much cleaner day as compared to what we see normally in Delhi, often in the winters. But as those of us who live in Delhi know how severe it can get. So it's the topic which we have, fossil fuels and environment, is quite a timely one for Delhi and for India, not only for the global implications of the global emissions, but also for the local emissions which plague us and has consequences which we possibly haven't seen yet, because some of those consequences play out over a period of time, especially in terms of health. So just coming to the core theme about fossil fuels and environment, I think it's also important to understand what contribution fossil fuels have made to the global economy. We live in a world that is undoubtedly more prosperous than it has ever been. And the principal contribution to that is from fossil fuels. The first industrial revolution 2.5 centuries ago was driven by fossil fuels. That's what got us over here. We shouldn't forget. But then, unfortunately, time has also brought us to the point where the tide has turned. So what started the New World Order some centuries ago, 2.5 centuries ago, and that same economic development, that same world order is now putting us and the planet at great risk of, if I can call that, destruction as well. We don't need to wait for evidences anymore. Data is very clearly there to see that the world has hottened up in the past 30 years in particular at an alarming pace. And this is, by now, is irrespective of the deniers. It's very clear that it's because of anthropogenic causes, because of man-made causes. We've seen evidences. We have Tim Buckley and others from Australia over here. We've seen what happened in Australia this summer in Australia, where 11 million hectares of land was under fire, and much of it, forested land, was under fire. We don't count the CO2 emission cost of that, but that's a very significant amount of CO2 emissions happening because it's a cycle, and that cycle is playing out, and it's going to have some very, very significant consequences for us. In Antarctica, penguins are disappearing at an amazing rate, but what you would have seen day before yesterday in the newspapers, Antarctica is seeing temperatures of 20 degrees centigrade. Now, that's not something which you associate with Antarctica. You associate that with Bangalore, right? So that's what is happening. But closer to us in India, we are seeing weather events, climate events happening at an amazing pace, amazing regularity, very disturbing regularity. So the east coast of India, which is very prone, has always been prone to weather conditions, now are seeing the Phylins and the Fanis of the world happening very, very regularly. It all has a cost. It has a cost, but it's also the climate change effects are discriminatory. It affects the poor much more than it affects the richer people. It has a very big gender implication, as we heard Mr. Tanaka speak about, that it's discriminatory towards women because it affects women more than it affects others. But we shouldn't forget, eventually it gets to all of us, irrespective of what gender we are from, what strata of society we are from. It will get to all of us. And I think that's why it is important to make that start very, very rapidly towards mending the status if we can. So it's not about whether we need to act, but how rapidly we can act, how energetically we can act. And this is a forum on energy, so it's possibly the right term to use over here, that we need to act really energetically. And in India, we are at an enormous advantage if we choose to act. We have 300 days of tropical sunshine every year, and that's a great blessing. We have a coastline, and coastlines do lead to wind conditions which allow for wind generation to happen. So we have a very reasonable wind generation onshore, but hopefully some of it offshore as well, especially on the western coast in places like Gujarat. We have a very large electricity grid. We have the largest synchronous electricity grid, which actually can help balance renewables very well. And coupled with electricity markets, which have been growing in India at a very quick pace, we do have the possibility of balancing the variability of renewables. So what you saw in Mr. Tanaka's chart over there, the 2040 impacts of variability, you can have storage, but you also have a large grid which helps you balance in a large country like India the effects of variability. We also have a large thermal and hydro generation fleet, which can be called to flex and balance. Now, when you saw again, I'm referring to the chart because that's quite easy reference, and thank you, Mr. Tanaka, for those for the data points. But you saw that there's in the renewable sector, you saw a large component of hydro, which we have about 55 gigawatts or 55 gigawatts of hydro available. It's one of the best resources to balance. But we also can use coal. We are not going away from coal that quickly. We can use the coal-based power plant by bringing more flexibility in the coal to not use coal as a mainline resource, but as a balancing resource still exists. So I think there are some changes to be made, and we can manage. But the biggest thing is that we are not dependent on indigenous fossil fuels as an economy like the Middle Eastern countries are. Those are exporters. Even the US is turning an exporter, so they have an economic dependence on fossil fuels. We do not have an economic dependence on fossil fuel exports, so most of our commercial energy is imported. So we have all the natural incentives to grow green. I've just given you a few, but we have all the natural incentives to go green. But when we do that, we have to make our choices carefully and wisely. As a growing economy, we must keep it adequately fueled. So we can't get to a point where we don't have adequate energies to serve our people, because that is also discriminatory. When we don't have adequate energy, it affects the poor more than anybody else. We have seen that in the past, before energy adequacy came in, before the people had commercial energy through Saubhagya and other schemes of Government of India, we've seen how our villages have suffered. So it is important to have adequate energy access, given that we are very differently placed from the rest of the world, from US, UK, rest of Europe, Australia, or even China. Our growth stage is quite different from China. So we have some choices to make, clearly. So what should those choices be guided by? I've already talked about the fact that we have the incentives to go to renewables, but I have a few specific recommendations to make, some of which may not be completely popular, but I'm okay with that. The first is that we should shut down all uneconomical fossil fuel-based plants. And there's a lot of it in India, and I would say that about 30 gigawatts you could shut down today of coal-fired power plants, and you wouldn't even feel it, because there's enough supply in the system. It'll save the country money. We often keep them alive because we have vested interests in keeping them alive. Employees there, somebody wants their own control over the coal supply and what comes with it. But essentially, we can shut down those plants without a problem, and it'll save the country money, it'll save the environment. And there are obvious other benefits in terms of water use, say, for example, where we are a water-stressed country, increasingly going to be climate stress and water stress go together. So we would do well to act in advance to make sure that we are taking those steps which are logical but otherwise do not happen automatically. The second recommendation I have is, of course, to ramp up the renewable energy portfolio. As we saw, we have the potential, we have the policy intent also, because Prime Minister has made the intent very, very clear. But when we make that choice, we also need to recognize that if we take it, something has to give. And to me, the first point I made connects very well. Fossil fuels have to give. So that's where the transition has to happen. My third suggestion is to recycle carbon. So we will have some carbon, significant amount of carbon content, but we can recycle. And here some very interesting work has been done by Indian companies. So for example, Indian Oil is producing ethanol in its Panipat refinery through bioprocesses, bioenergy processes. It's using a refinery off gas. And the more we do of that, the more we recycle. I mean, that's one example. Even in Faridabad, Dr. Ramkumar was here receiving the award in the morning. He's, of course, pioneering a lot of that. A lot of waste plastic is actually now being converted to bitumen, and roads are getting tarred by that. And those are just a couple of examples. You can have, the moment you push innovation in, you can recycle the carbon molecule again and again and again and again to make sure what is actually a challenge becomes a resource. So it is very important that we treat carbon as a resource, but to do that, we need to bring in a lot of innovation, and we must encourage and reward that innovation. We also seen some things where social problems or economic problems which we are seeing, like waste burning, can be addressed through schemes like Satat, which Honorable Minister talked about in the morning. And that has many benefits, of course. It does with a crop residue burning problem. It produces biogas. It causes local employment. It causes a lot of immediate challenges in terms of local environment, as we see in Delhi, also to be addressed. But it's not just Delhi, right? Even the hinterland in Punjab, in Haryana, in Uttar Pradesh, all are getting affected. So it is important that we promote those, because the moment we are willing to work harder on those matters, there's a lot of gains to be had, a lot of wider social gains to be had. And this is where we have to turn those challenges and problems into opportunities, and we must act with alacrity. Basing on the same, but how do we do that? And I think the basing on the same principle of reuse of the carbon molecule, what we have to do is introduce extended value chain management responsibilities. So as an organization, if you're a producer of any of those carbon-intensive products, your job, or you say, for example, petrochemicals, where we heard the minister again say that we are going to scale up our petrochemicals production, it's going to become a primary user of hydrocarbons. But then for the petrochemical product manufacturer, the responsibility cannot be just to import the input and sell the output. It has to start much before the input comes in, and it has to go much beyond the output is sold, because you have to have the recycling industry set in place. We need mandates over there. We need a policy framework over there. Our current policy framework is developing, but it's still rudimentary. And we need to really get that going. Again, the same theme happens, that it becomes a problem, becomes a resource for us. In doing all of this, my next suggestion is that we use technology as much as possible in every step. And when we do that, when we introduce technology, India is an innovator in technology. It's a digital innovator. But when we do that, we bake in sustainability at the core of technology deployment, not as an after effect. And we'll see that there's an enormous economic and social value when we bake sustainability at the core of technology deployment, rather than just a side benefit if it happens. It can add hugely to financial and environmental outcomes. All of this change will not come easily, because it is about culture. It's not so much about technology again, it's about culture. And culture comes from the top. So the boards of these organizations, the policy-making bodies in the ministries as well as in these organizations, have to really, really drive hard to bring about this culture. And when it is externally imposed with a good reason, there might be challenges, but they have to be accepted. And the direction to the bottom, which only executes, has to be very, very clear. Finally, I come to the role of governments. As far as Government of India is concerned, it is very clearly there to see that Government of India is committed. However, in India, implementation falls through. So various parts of the government don't talk to each other. We have 5 ministries which deal with the environment, energy and environmental matters. Actually more than that, 6 ministries which deal with energy and environmental matters. We are a federated structure, a country. So the implementation between the government, national and state government, the connection is not always very strong. Politically, they might be at other sides of the spectrum. But on this matter, when it is a common cause, it's a common concern, we need leadership to be demonstrated at the national level, at the state levels, and together to make sure that these things do not fall through the crack. It can be done. Just as Minister Pradhan mentioned in January, he called the states to see how we can promote use of LNG, CNG, and CBG on a much larger scale. And we saw 12 ministers came in, more than 20 states were represented, and we saw some very, very enthusiastic participation. So I really must put it to Mr. Pradhan for his leadership, but we need a lot more of that. Let me close with one realization. It is very important to recognize that we have in this room lots of students, and we have people like me or people even senior to me. But it's very important to recognize that a future generation does not see these issues in the same way, in the same lens as I see or the generation before me sees. We are, the more senior people in the room often are, victims of legacy. We have grown up that way, but the future generation hasn't grown up, and we will see a backlash if we don't make that change. And let me tell you that there's a financial cost associated with the backlash. So the leaders of the oil and gas companies, the coal companies, the power companies must recognize that there's a financial cost. And I quote as an example of what is happening in the stock markets in the US, where today one Apple as a company, is more valuable than all the listed energy companies of the US put together. One company, which is Apple, more valuable on the stock market than all the listed companies, US energy companies put together. And the value of the US listed energy companies has shrunk in the last 5 years by about 40%. Apple correspondingly has grown much more than 40% to be where it is. So I think we need to look at through the financial lens. We will be irresponsible to our shareholders if we don't recognize that dimension. In fact, the companies which we see in the energy world are under significant financial exposure or stress. If we accept it or we don't accept it, but the writing is on the wall. I'll just end with a few data points for you. In May 2019, oil touched $80 per barrel when pipelines were sabotaged in Saudi Arabia. In June, the next month, they were down to $62 per barrel, and the following month to $55 per barrel. So a big sabotage of pipeline happens, oil goes up, and it comes down. On September 16th, there was a drone attack which took out nearly 5% of, more than 5% of global oil processing capability. Prices rose to $68. In October, 1 month down the line, it was down to $58. On January 5th, right after General Qasem Soleimani was assassinated in Iraq, prices rose to $70 per barrel. Just a month later, on the same date, on February 5th, it stood at $55 per barrel. Today it is below that under the global effects of the coronavirus. So you see, nothing actually holds the price up anymore. So when you look at traditional oil and gas companies or energy companies, very traditional companies, they are under fundamental stress. And the earlier they do and recognize the changes and make amends, the better for them and the better for the world as well. Some companies have done. What used to be Dong Energy in Europe, which is a Danish company, Danish Oil and Natural Gas, that's what Dong was, changed not only its name to Ørsted, but changed its philosophy entirely. And today it's from a predominantly 80-90% oil and gas company, it's down to less than 10% oil and gas, and it's proposing to go to zero. And its chairman, CEO, proudly says that I can prove to you that risk-adjusted returns of my strategy is much higher than what that is of the traditional hydrocarbon companies, including the global majors, the super majors. So with those thoughts, let me end over here and underline that thing, that the time to act was possibly yesterday, but no better than now to start fresh and energetically. Thank you.